When the Library of Alexandria burned, the world forgot how to remember. Thousands of years of thought, math, poetry, medicine, philosophy, turned to smoke in a single night. No war ever killed so many minds at once. But what if I told you the fall of Alexandria wasn't a tragedy? It was a warning we've ignored for 2,000 years. Before it burned, it was paradise, a city built by a dying king, where knowledge was worshipped like a god. They called it the lighthouse of the world, and for a moment, it truly was. But light, no matter how bright, always casts a shadow. This is the story of that shadow, the story of the last light of Alexandria. In the final days of his life, Alexander the Great was no longer a conqueror, he was a ghost, haunted by what he could not build. His empire stretched from Greece to India, but his body had begun to fail him. He was 32, his breath shallow, his eyes fixed toward the horizon of Egypt. His generals leaned in, waiting for one last command. And with the last of his strength, he whispered, "There, by the edge of the Nile, build me a city that will never die." Some thought it the rambling of a fevered man, but others heard destiny speaking. A year later, near the island of Pharos, they marked the lines of a city in the sand, a perfect grid, streets that would run straight as arrows toward eternity. They called it Alexandria, after the man who dreamed it. But what they built was more than a city. It was a bridge between worlds. Greek ambition, Egyptian wisdom, Eastern mystery. The stones laid there were not for walls, but for ideas. Because Alexandria was meant to be a home for all knowledge, a place where truth could be gathered, not conquered. One of Alexander's successors, Ptolemy I, took that dying wish and turned it into a purpose. He gathered philosophers, astronomers, doctors from Athens, Babylon, India, and gave them a home. He built the library, and beside it, the Museum, a temple to the Muses, where the human mind itself was holy. There were gardens, lecture halls, observatories, and within its marble halls, the world began to change. It's hard for us to imagine what Alexandria felt like. Ships from every corner of the known world crowded its harbor. From each ship, scrolls were taken, copied, studied, and stored in the great halls. Every text that entered the city was duplicated by royal decree. Even if you came as a merchant, your cargo was knowledge first, trade second. The library became a living thing. It breathed with every scholar who entered, every argument, every discovery. Here, Eratosthenes measured the earth with shadows and sunlight and was almost perfectly right. Here, Euclid defined geometry. Herophilus studied the human body, cutting through superstition to touch the truth. And Hypatia, centuries later, would walk its marble streets teaching men how to think freely. In Alexandria, knowledge was not power, it was faith. But like every faith, it had heretics. Not everyone believed knowledge should be free. Kings feared it. Priests resented it. Because knowledge does what armies cannot. It questions the divine. And when men begin to question, empires begin to shake. The more Alexandria learned, the more dangerous it became. Not to the world, but to those who ruled it. The first fires came quietly. During Julius Caesar's campaign in Egypt, his ships burned in the harbor. The flames leapt from vessel to vessel, and some say, into the library itself. No one knows how much was lost that night. Some said 40,000 scrolls, others 400,000. No one could count what no one understood. But Alexandria survived, scorched, shaken, but alive. Because a city of ideas does not die from fire alone. It dies from forgetting. Over centuries, the fires came again, when empires changed hands, when faith replaced philosophy, when the sword silenced the scholar. And yet, each time the light flickered back to life, until one day, it didn't. To understand Alexandria, you must understand what it meant to those who built it. For the Greeks, it was proof that human reason could touch the divine. For the Egyptians, it was a bridge, the mortal and immortal finally meeting. For the world, it was hope, that knowledge could unite where war divided. And for centuries, it did. Merchants from India debated with scholars from Athens. Astronomers from Babylon argued with priests of Ra. The library's scrolls were written in every language known: Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, Sanskrit. It was as if humanity had built its own brain. But the greater the light, the longer the shadow it casts. As knowledge spread, so did doubt. As wisdom grew, so did arrogance. Scholars began to believe they had surpassed the gods, that man was now the center of the universe. And perhaps that was Alexandria's first sin. Because when man begins to believe he is divine, he forgets that all fire burns, even the fire of knowledge. Centuries passed. The golden age of Alexandria dimmed into dusk. Rome conquered Egypt. The library became a relic, its guardians scattered, its scrolls neglected. Philosophy gave way to politics. Faith began to wage war against reason. And somewhere between the marble columns, silence began to grow. The silence of forgetting. By the time the Christians arrived, Alexandria was already hollow. Its wisdom labeled heresy, its philosophers hunted. And when Hypatia, the last true light of that city, was dragged through the streets and killed by a mob, it wasn't just a woman who died. It was an idea. The idea that knowledge could save us. They say the Library of Alexandria is gone, that its ashes mixed with sand and sea. But maybe it was never truly lost. Every library built after, every school, every page, is a spark from that first flame. Because the men and women who once read in its halls carried that light inside them, and through them the fire spread. We still search for it today, in every question we ask, in every truth we refuse to ignore. Alexandria was not just a city. It was a reminder that memory is fragile, that civilization, no matter how great, is only as strong as the will to remember. And so, the last light of Alexandria still burns, not in stone, not in scrolls, but in us. Because knowledge is not lost until we choose to stop seeking it.
The flames that once devoured Alexandria began long before the fire ever touched its stones. They were born in the hearts of men, in their hunger to know, to question, to reach beyond the mortal boundaries of their own ignorance. Long before the city's fall, there was a moment when the world seemed reborn, a moment when light had a name, and that name was Alexandria. Founded by a conqueror who never lived to see its greatness, Alexandria rose upon the shoulders of an empire drunk on ambition. After Alexander the Great's death, his dream was carved into marble and sand by his general Ptolemy, a man who sought to preserve not only his king's memory, but the very essence of human wisdom itself. While other cities built temples for gods, Ptolemy built a temple for the mind. He called it the Library of Alexandria. It was not merely a building, it was a promise, a vow whispered to the ages that no idea, no story, no spark of thought should ever be lost again. And so they began to collect. From Athens to Babylon, from the Nile to the Indus, every scroll, every fragment, every whisper of knowledge was brought to this new sanctuary of reason. Ships docking in Alexandria were searched not for gold, but for words. If a vessel carried books, the scribes would take them, copy them, and return the replicas, keeping the originals within the library's sacred walls. To the scholars who walked its marble corridors, the library was alive. The sound of footsteps echoed between shelves like heartbeats. The scent of papyrus mixed with salt from the sea breeze. Here, words were not dead symbols, they breathed. The library became the beating heart of the ancient world. It was said that if all humanity vanished and only Alexandria remained, the world could be reborn again from its scrolls. Inside, thousands of minds converged. Mathematicians, poets, astronomers, physicians, dreamers. They called themselves the philosophoi, the lovers of wisdom. Among them was Eratosthenes, who measured the earth's circumference with nothing but shadows and thought. He proved that the world was round centuries before the first sail dared to test it. There was Herophilus, who dissected the human body to understand its secrets, earning both reverence and fear. He traced the pulse of life itself and called it by name. And Hypatia, the last light of Alexandria, though her time would come later, her spirit was already written in the city's veins. For in Alexandria, knowledge was not divided between man and woman, God and mortal. Here, only truth mattered. Each scholar lived with an unspoken faith that the more they knew, the closer they might come to the divine, that in studying the stars, they were reading the handwriting of creation. But even paradise has its shadows, for the more knowledge they gathered, the more they realized how much they did not know. And in that realization, the seeds of ruin were quietly sown. Because to question everything, even the gods, is a dangerous act. And in Alexandria, questions burned brighter than any flame. The library was said to hold 500,000 scrolls. Imagine it, corridors stretching endlessly, scrolls piled like waves of ink and thought. Within those walls slept the stories of nations long dead, languages no longer spoken, and wisdom humanity had not yet earned. But knowledge is a strange kind of power. It inspires the humble and terrifies the proud. When kings visited the library, they felt small. When priests entered, they felt threatened, because in Alexandria, truth did not bow. The scholars worshipped logic more than law, discovery more than doctrine. They believed the universe could be understood, not feared. And to some, that was blasphemy. In the shadow of the lighthouse, where fire once symbolized guidance, a new fire began to smolder, the fire of envy, of fear, of control. The library stood as the greatest monument to human intellect, but to the powerful, it became a reminder of what they could never fully rule, the human mind itself. Still, The scholars wrote, they argued, they laughed, they translated the world one fragment at a time. They dreamed of flight, of machines, of music drawn from the stars, and for a brief, impossible moment in history, humanity touched something eternal, a light not born from conquest, but from curiosity. Some said the gods smiled upon Alexandria. Others whispered that they envied it, because for the first time man was close to becoming divine, not through worship, but through understanding. That is the paradox of the library's rise. It was built from devotion to knowledge, and yet it was this very devotion that would one day destroy it. The more they read, the more they doubted. The more they learned, the less they feared. And in a world ruled by faith, the fearless are often the first to fall. But for now, the library stood untouched. Its marble gleamed beneath the sun like the bones of a god. The lighthouse guided ships to its harbor, and from every corner of the earth the curious came. They came not for gold or glory, but for meaning, for truth, for the hope that somewhere, hidden between the lines of an ancient scroll, lay the answer to what it meant to be human. And in the stillness of those endless halls, you could almost hear it, the hum of knowledge itself, like the heartbeat of civilization. The library's rise was not a tale of power, but of passion. It was the story of what happens when humanity decides to remember, when we refuse to let darkness define us. But memory is fragile, and every light that rises must one day face its night. For even as Alexandria shone brighter than any city before it, the world beyond its walls was changing, and shadows were gathering on the horizon. The library had awakened humanity's hunger for truth, but truth has a cost, and soon Alexandria would learn that not all fires come from the sky. They said knowledge could not die, but I have seen its ashes. My name is lost to history, erased like the ink on the scrolls I once copied. But in those days they called me the scribe, not for my wisdom, but for my patience, the patience to listen to words older than kings and to hide them when the world no longer deserved them. I was born within the library's shadow, and I will die beneath its smoke. When I was young, I believed the library was eternal. Its marble floors glowed beneath the sun. Its columns stretched toward heaven like prayers carved in stone. Every day, I watched scholars from distant lands, Greeks, Persians, Hebrews, Hindus, each carrying pieces of a greater truth, each believing that knowledge would save us. But as I grew older, I learned something cruel. Knowledge saves no one. It only remembers. The library had its secrets, more than the world ever knew. Beneath its grand halls, beyond the public chambers, there were rooms that no visitor entered, doors that no torch lit. We called it the Archive of Shadows. There, the most dangerous texts were kept, writings forbidden by kings and priests alike, not because they were false, but because they were true. I remember the day I was first chosen to enter. The chief librarian, Demetrius, handed me a key, small, bronze, heavy with meaning. He said, "What you see below, you will never speak of above, for truth is heavier than any empire can bear." The air was thick with dust, and the walls were lined with clay jars, sealed with wax, marked with symbols I did not understand. Some scrolls whispered of gods that bled, others of stars that ruled men's fates, and some spoke of a world that would one day forget its own light. In those archives, I copied texts that should never have existed, mathematics that predicted the motion of the heavens with terrifying precision, medical knowledge that could heal beyond prayer, and philosophies that asked whether gods were merely reflections of human fear. Every night I wrote. Every morning I prayed the guards would never find what I had seen, because even within the library, truth had enemies. The scholars above debated poetry and planets, but below we guarded the forbidden, the words that could unmake belief. And as the city grew brighter, so did its shadows. I began to notice strange visitors, men cloaked in silence, speaking of purity and faith. They said knowledge had gone too far, that men had begun to reach for what should not be known. They came with smiles first, then with threats, then with fire. Before the flames, before the riots, before the lighthouse dimmed, we knew it was coming. Demetrius told me, "When fire comes for truth, hide it where even fire cannot reach." So we did. We copied the most sacred scrolls, the lost works of Aristotle, the star maps of the Babylonians, the sacred hymns of the East, and sealed them within clay amphora, buried beneath the floors, hidden in catacombs beneath the Serapeum Temple. We called it the Silent Seed, a hope that one day someone would find them again. But hope is a fragile thing. When the soldiers came, I was in the lower hall transcribing a fragment of Heraclitus. The walls shook with shouts and the crack of torches. Smoke bled through the ceiling like the breath of a dying god. One by one, the shelves became pyres. The scrolls curled like leaves, their words turning to dust. I remember trying to save one, just one, but it disintegrated in my hands, the letters lifting into the air like black birds. They said the library burned for 3 days. To me, it felt like 3 eternities. I survived only because I was below, in the archive of shadows. But survival is not mercy, it is punishment. For in that darkness, I listened to the world end, not with screams, but with silence. When the fire died, I climbed out from beneath the ruins. The marble was cracked, the statues broken, and where the library once stood, only embers remained. I thought I would weep, but I could not, because in the ashes I found something still alive. A jar, sealed, unbroken. I held it to my chest as though it were a child, and I realized the library was not truly dead. It had only gone to sleep. Somewhere, beneath the rubble, beneath the bones of scholars and the soot of centuries, the silent seed still waited. For someone, for some day.
Now I am old. My eyes fail, my hands tremble. But I write these words not for kings nor for gods, but for you, whoever you are, who still believes that knowledge is worth remembering. They will tell you the library burned. They will tell you that its wisdom was lost forever. Do not believe them, because truth does not burn. It hides. It waits. And when the world is ready, it returns. Perhaps you, hearing my words now, are the echo of that return. If so, then know this: the fire that took Alexandria did not destroy it. It simply passed the torch. And as long as one mind dares to remember, as long as one voice whispers the name Alexandria into the dark, the library still lives. I am the last scribe, and this is my confession. The secret archives were never buried in stone. They were buried in us. And every question we ask, in every truth we seek, in every book opened in defiance of silence, there a library breathes again. So when you close your eyes tonight and you hear the faint crackle of fire, do not think of loss, think of light, because Alexandria did not die in flame. It was reborn in it.
They say the fire died centuries ago, but in truth, it never stopped burning. It burned in silence, in the hearts of those who remembered, and in the hearts of those who feared remembering. When the great library fell, the world did not fall with it. It simply forgot how to rise. Centuries passed. Empires changed their names. The gods of marble turned to dust, and the language of wisdom became the whisper of ghosts. But not all light had vanished. In a city still called Alexandria, where the wind carried the scent of the old harbor and broken marble, a woman stood alone, the last scholar of the ancient world. Her name was Hypatia. She was born long after the library's embers cooled, but its spirit lived within her veins. Her father, Theon, was one of the last mathematicians to teach beneath the shattered columns of the old museum. He raised her not as a daughter, but as a disciple, a vessel for the wisdom that the world had begun to forget. While other girls learned the language of obedience, Hypatia learned the language of the stars. By the time she was grown, her mind had become a mirror of the heavens, bright, cold, infinite. In her lectures, she spoke not of gods but of geometry, not of miracles but of motion, not of sin but of reason. And people came. From every corner of a fading empire they came, pagans and Christians, scholars and seekers, all drawn to the light of her mind. To hear Hypatia speak was to remember what Alexandria once was, a place where thought itself was sacred. But the world had changed. Faith had become a sword, and reason a threat. The old library was gone, yet its ghost still haunted the city, in the marble ruins, in the scattered scrolls, in the dangerous idea that knowledge should belong to all. To the new rulers of Alexandria, that ghost was heresy. There was a man, Cyril, the patriarch of the church, who feared her light more than any darkness. He saw in Hypatia not a woman, but the living memory of a world that dared to question. And nothing terrifies power more than memory. He whispered that she was a witch, that her mind was a tool of demons, that her words poisoned faith itself. The whispers became sermons, the sermons became shouts, and soon Alexandria once again began to burn, not with fire,
but with hatred. Hypatia saw it coming. She always did. The stars, she said, moved in patterns, and so did men. She could trace the orbit of their violence long before it arrived. Yet she stayed. Why? Because to flee would mean to let ignorance win, and she would rather die for knowledge than live without it. The morning they came for her, the streets were silent. Dust drifted like ash through the air. She walked through the agora, past the stones that once marked the entrance to the library, past the ghosts of scholars and the echo of their words. They called her names she did not answer. They hurled stones she did not fear. And when they dragged her into the old temple, she did not scream, because she understood something her killers never would, that death cannot touch truth. They tore her apart, as they once tore apart the scrolls, as they once tore apart the library itself. But just as before, the fire they lit only spread the light further. In that moment, Hypatia became more than a woman. She became a symbol, the last living ember of Alexandria. And though her body was destroyed, her mind slipped into eternity, written not in ink or stone, but in the conscience of every soul that still dares to ask why. After her death, silence fell upon the city once more. The serapeum crumbled, the scholars scattered, and the age of reason gave way to the long night of faith. But even darkness, however vast, cannot erase the memory of light. For every question whispered in defiance, for every book opened in secret, for every child who looks at the stars and wonders what lies beyond, Hypatia still speaks. History will tell you that the Library of Alexandria was destroyed, but that is not true. It was murdered, slowly, by fear, by politics, by men who believed that burning a truth could erase it. But the truth is fireproof. It hides in the margins, in forgotten languages, in dreams that refuse to die. And sometimes, when the wind passes through the ruins of the ancient city, you can almost hear it, the whisper of pages turning, the quiet breath of a library that refuses to be forgotten. I often wonder, what would Hypatia say if she could see us now? Would she weep for what we lost? Or would she smile, knowing that her death was not the end, but a spark that would one day ignite the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the modern world itself? Perhaps that was the library's final miracle, that even in destruction, it planted the seeds of rebirth. Because every time a mind chooses reason over rage, every question that breaks through dogma, every flame of curiosity that is lit in the dark, Alexandria lives again. The library was not made of stone and scrolls. It was made of people, of every thinker who dared to believe that knowledge could set us free. And so when Hypatia fell, the world bowed its head, not to mourn her death, but to listen, because in her silence we finally heard the truth the library had been whispering since its birth, that light does not belong to gods. It belongs to those who seek it. Time buried the city. The harbor silted. The lighthouse collapsed. The marble turned to dust. But under every civilization that rose after, Rome, Baghdad, Florence, London, a single ember of Alexandria still glowed. The fire that once devoured the library became the fire that forged the modern mind. And though we have built new towers of knowledge, we are still haunted by the same question. Will we protect this light or let it burn again? 2,000 years have passed, and still the story of Alexandria feels unfinished. Maybe it always will be. Because the library was never just a place. It was a promise that we as a species would choose to remember, to learn, to rise. And that promise still burns in every word written, in every truth spoken, in every soul that refuses to forget. So if someday you stand beneath the ruins of the ancient harbor and the wind feels warm, do not think it is just the sun. It is the breath of the library, the last light of Alexandria, still waiting, still burning, still alive, inside you.
They thought the library was gone. But knowledge has a way of escaping, like smoke slipping through fingers, or whispers that travel farther than screams. Long after the flames had turned marble to dust, a few scrolls remained, hidden in jars, carried by trembling hands, guarded by those who believed that memory itself was sacred. Among them was one man, a quiet figure history would never name, but whose footsteps carried the last breath of Alexandria across the dying world. They called him the Monk of the Dust Road. He was not born in Alexandria, nor had he ever seen its light. He was a child of exile, born in a monastery carved into the desert cliffs, where silence was prayer, and every grain of sand seemed older than the stars. Yet from his earliest days he felt haunted by a story, a city that once held all knowledge and a fire that tried to erase it. To him, the library was not a ruin of stone, it was a wound in time. One night, as the wind howled across the dunes, an old traveler arrived at the monastery. His robes were torn, his hands blackened with soot. He carried a clay jar, cracked, sealed with ancient wax, its surface marked with strange Greek letters. He did not speak. He simply placed the jar before the abbot and whispered, "This is all that's left." Then he died. Inside the jar, they found 6 scrolls, half burned, written in a language none of them could fully read. But the monk felt something awaken in him, as if the jar itself had been waiting for him. And that night, while others slept, he broke the rule of silence for the first time. He began to read. The scrolls spoke of a forgotten world, the geometry of the heavens, the anatomy of man, the nature of light, and the idea that reason was not a sin but a form of worship. Each line was a spark, and with every word he read, he felt the darkness inside him retreat. He realized then what the traveler had meant. This is all that's left, not of the library, but of humanity's courage to know. And so he made a vow. He would carry these scrolls to where knowledge still breathed, across the desert, across kingdoms, across faiths, to the scholars of the East
who still believed that light could be preserved through translation. The journey began at dawn. He wrapped the scrolls in linen, hid them beneath his robe, and walked into the endless horizon. The road was cruel. The sun burned his skin, the sand blinded his eyes, and at night the cold gnawed at his bones. But he walked on. He crossed the ruins of Memphis, where temples lay buried beneath shifting dunes. He crossed the Red Sea in a wooden boat that leaked with every wave. He crossed into Arabia, where merchants whispered of a new empire rising, one that sought knowledge, not conquest. And with every step, he felt the weight of Alexandria in his heart, not as sorrow, but as purpose. In Damascus, he found the first listeners, men who spoke of Bait al-Hikmah, a house of wisdom, a place where Greek and Indian, Persian and Egyptian thought were gathered, translated, preserved. There in the flickering candlelight, he met a young scholar who could read the faded ink. When the monk unrolled the scrolls, the young man's hands trembled. "These are fragments of Euclid, and something else," he said, "something we thought was lost forever." For days they worked together, copying, translating, breathing life into ashes. The monk did not understand all the words, but he understood the silence they broke. When the last line was transcribed, he bowed his head and whispered, "Now Alexandria will never die." But the journey did not end there. He traveled farther, to Jerusalem, to Baghdad, to Samarkand, leaving behind copies like seeds cast into fertile ground. He never sought fame, never claimed to be a savior of wisdom. He was only a messenger, a shadow carrying fire through the night. In every city he saw the same faces, children learning, teachers writing, dreamers looking at the stars, and in each he saw a reflection of the library, reborn, in pieces, across the world. Years passed. The monk grew old. His hair turned white, his hands unsteady, but he still carried one last scroll, the smallest, the most fragile, the one he had never shown anyone. On it were words that no one had yet translated, but that he somehow understood. Truth is a flame. It does not belong to those who light it, but to those who carry it. When he reached the edge of the Caspian, he built a small shrine of stones and sand. He placed the last scroll within it and whispered, "The fire has crossed the desert. My part is done." Then he sat down beneath the endless sky and closed his eyes. No one knows where his body lies, but they say that when the wind sweeps across those dunes, you can still hear the rustle of parchment under the sand, as if the earth itself remembers. Centuries later, when the scholars of Baghdad and Cordoba lit their lamps and copied Greek into Arabic, when the words of Aristotle, Archimedes, and Hypatia found their way back into Europe through translation, they owed their breath to a nameless monk who refused to let the ashes settle. His name was forgotten, but his journey became a bridge between the light that was lost and the light that would return. And so the fire of Alexandria lived on, not in marble halls or towering lighthouses, but in the hands of wanderers, in the prayers of seekers, in the quiet courage of those who choose to remember. The library story did not end in flames. It continued in footsteps. Because sometimes history is not saved by kings or armies, but by a single unseen soul who decides that forgetting is not an option. If you listen closely, in the silence between words, in the turning of a page, in the wind that crosses the old desert, you might still hear him, the monk, the last messenger of a dead library, walking forever toward the dawn, carrying the fire that never died.
They say the fire that burned Alexandria was the end. But endings are only seen that way by those who stop looking. For the rest of us, those who still listen to the silence between history's screams, the fire was not destruction. It was transformation, because flames do not only consume, they also create light. Centuries have passed since the smoke rose over the Mediterranean. Empires came and fell. Kings turned to dust. Languages vanished, and the very stars above Egypt shifted in their paths. But the fire never truly went out. It changed form. It leapt from papyrus to parchment, from parchment to paper, from paper to silicon, from the breath of philosophers to the hum of machines. The same hunger that once filled Alexandria's halls now hums in every human who dares to ask, what if there's more? Today we hold in our hands what the ancients could only dream of, a library without walls, a flame without end, and yet we are still haunted by the same question that burned in the eyes of Hypatia, of Eratosthenes, of every nameless scribe who dared to learn. Will we protect the light, or will we watch it burn again? The eternal flame is not made of fire. It is made of memory, of courage, of the quiet refusal to let ignorance win. Every act of learning, every whispered story, every book read under dim light, every question that begins with why, is a spark that joins that ancient fire. You and I, and all who came before us, are the keepers of it now. Imagine the first spark, when a human, alone in the dark, rubbed two stones together and brought light into being. That moment was the birth of every library, every school, every idea ever written or spoken. Alexandria was only one chapter in that story, a temple of flame that dared to make thought eternal. And though the sea swallowed its walls, its spirit escaped through the ink of those who refused to forget. If you listen closely, you can still hear it, not in ruins, but in voices, in the child asking questions his elders cannot answer, in the teacher who stays after class explaining one last line to a tired student, in the scientist staring at stars, wondering what waits beyond light, in the writer who bleeds truth onto paper, knowing no one may read it. These are the new librarians, the guardians of the unseen flame. Some say the world is drowning in noise, that knowledge has become a flood instead of a fountain, and they are right. But even floods need light to reflect. The danger was never in knowing too much. It was in forgetting why we learned at all. Knowledge is not a collection of facts. It is the story of us, our rise, our ruin, our endless desire to understand the divine logic hidden in everything. Once Alexandria stood as a monument to that desire. Now it lives inside us. Every generation rebuilds its own version, sometimes of glass and code, sometimes of silence and memory, but always in defiance of oblivion. And that is the true miracle. Not that the library was built, but that even after it fell, the idea of it never died. They found fragments of its scrolls scattered across the earth, a few words of geometry, a half-burned poem, a treatise on stars. Nothing complete, nothing whole. But that is how knowledge survives, in fragments, in imperfect hands, in the courage to continue what was broken. The fire never asks to be perfect. It only asks to be passed on. If you ever doubt that Alexandria still exists, look into a screen, or open a book, or walk through a library at midnight. Every flicker of light, every thought preserved, is a resurrection. The eternal flame burns quietly beneath the noise of our modern world, waiting for those who still believe that wisdom is sacred. Perhaps that is all we ever were, a species chasing fire, from torches to stars. And maybe that is enough, because as long as we keep walking toward that light, Alexandria never truly fell. It only changed its form, from stone to story, from city to soul. So remember this. Every question you ask is a match struck in the dark. Every truth you seek is a candle carried through time. And every act of remembering is a rebellion against the night. That is the legacy of the library. That is the gift of those who refused to let the last flame die. And when our own world begins to fade, when our towers crumble and our machines fall silent, let those who come after us find the same thing in our ashes that we once found in theirs. A spark, a story, a reason to begin again. The eternal flame does not belong to Alexandria anymore. It belongs to you. Guard it, feed it, carry it forward, because the fire that once lit the sea now lives in every mind brave enough to remember. And as long as even one remembers, Alexandria still burns.